This is Cannaramic, and we're bringing you cannabis like you've never seen it before.
I said, I know we're not going to do Skype because you don't like talking to machines.
Right, that's correct.
Okay. I completely understand. I don't like it too much either, but it's the way of the world. But I appreciate you so much for making time for this interview. What we're trying to do here at Cannaramic is really demystify and destigmatize cannabis for everyday people. And we're talking in this summit with over 500,000 people who are curious about cannabis, who are excited about the possibilities for their lives, enthusiastic about using it for medical purposes, but also very, very confused and overwhelmed by just so much information. So our goal here is to kind of really bring it to the level where a regular, everyday person can relate and can understand and be able to be empowered to move forward with being able to get the benefits of medical cannabis in their lives.
Okay.
Awesome. So I'm just going to get started and we'll talk a little bit about your background. And I don't want to spend too much time on your bio because I think that most people should know who you are and kind of have the overall genesis story. But we really want to talk about, where things are going. And just to kind of give a little basis for folks, you've received all type of accolades from all over, the scientific community. You have been acknowledged with all types of prizes. You've done over how many studies? You've done over 500 or 400 studies, I'm sure, on cannabis, I think I read. So you've already been here for over 50 years, correct, doing cannabis research?
Yeah, more or less.
All of that. And so your backgrounds are impeccable. As a matter of fact, you're called the father of cannabis research. So what I was thinking, with all of these people who are now excited about cannabis, they're excited because of what you discovered, because of what you isolated. Because prior to that, people had been very, very, they had a negative connotation for cannabis. So actually, you're also not only the father of cannabis research, you're actually the father of all of these cannabis enthusiasts who are now excited about the possibilities for cannabis in their life. You really impacted everyday people. How exciting is that to know that the work that you did over 50 years ago is really touching people's lives in a meaningful way right now?
Well, what's the question? What would you like me to discuss?
Just really what it means to you to be in a position where the work that you did, you probably didn't realize how far it would go and what impact it would have on people. But everyday people are now talking about THC and CBD and the endocannabinoid system. These are words that are now part of our everyday vocabulary. As a matter of fact, they're now in the Merriam-Webster's dictionary. So what does it mean to know that your work has reached this far?
Well, when we started research of cannabis, when I started doing it as a young person, I was kind of surprised that while the chemistry, the pharmacology, the clinical effects of morphine, been isolated from opium, it's well known for over a century, and the same for cocaine. Not so much was known about cannabis, and actually the active compounds or compounds had never been isolated in pure form, and therefore the further research was very difficult. So as a scientist, I thought that we should try, that my lab should try to do that. And I got some cannabis, hashish, from the police actually, and started working, trying to isolate a compound. And yes, we were able to identify, to isolate in pure form, I think for the first time ever, the active compound of cannabis, and to identify its structure, later to synthesize it so people could go ahead and do research with this compound. But it turned out that there are many additional compounds. None of them have that particular effect that THC does. THC, surprisingly, is the only one compound, amongst many, many others that are present in cannabis, that causes changes in mood and emotions and the well-known marijuana effects. But speaking about it, at that time very few people were interested in marijuana. As a matter of fact, I asked for a grant, an NIH grant, and I was told that nobody smokes marijuana in the States. That when I had something more relevant to the U.S., I should apply. Marijuana was not relevant at that time. Well, it turned out that it became relevant a little bit later, a few years later, and NIH became very interested. As a matter of fact, NIH supported my research for over 45 years.
Wow.
But we worked originally in the chemistry. We had to identify the compounds. We elucidated the structure of cannabidiol. Cannabidiol had been isolated previously, about a decade previously, and quite a few additional compounds. So there we were. The chemistry was elucidated, and we worked in metabolism and what happens to these compounds in the body and how they act in collaboration with pharmacologists. We looked at the activity in animals and a few clinical trials as well. And this went on for another 20 years.
Wow.
One thing that was not known at that time was how THC acts. And an American group, Alan Howlett, discovered a receptor, a place in the brain, that's a protein in the brain. The THC binds to it and activates it, and that's the way it acts.
And is that,
now,
is that,
Sorry?
Is that protein, is that anandamide?
Well, what happened was that, you see, we don't have receptors because there is a plant out there. We have receptors because we, or the animals, produce something that activates them. It's part of our system. So we went ahead looking for the compounds that we produce, so the animals produce. These are the same compounds. And after quite a few years of work, we discovered two compounds that our brain produces, and mice produce them, and so on. And these compounds bind to the cannabinoid receptor. We called one of them anandamide, and the other is known as 2-AG. And these are compounds that THC mimics their action.
So when you started this research in the 60s, you were in the middle of researching a element that had been already exposed to propaganda. There was anti-cannabis propaganda movies like Reefer Madness and The Devil's Weed. At the time of your discovery, there was also, cannabis was illegal in the U.S. and in Israel and other parts of the world. With a bad reputation, such a bad reputation for cannabis and also it being illegal, why would you want to look into it? Was there something you were trying to prove? Was there a hypothesis in your mind that cannabis had real medicinal value that we were missing out on with aside from all the propaganda?
Well, academics look at things that are important, and that's what I did. I saw that cannabis, which was being used at that time as well. Millions of people were using it all over the world, and therefore the chemistry, the pharmacology, the clinical effects have to be known. It doesn't matter whether it's illegal or legal. As a matter of fact, I had no problems. I got my material from the police. I got all the permits that were needed. I had no bureaucratic problems, and I was allowed to do the research. Probably people realize that in an academic atmosphere in a university, this research can be done, and it was done.
Awesome. So you actually, in the documentary about your life called The Scientist, you talk about these compounds. You say, and this is a quote, "We have a group of compounds, an endogenous system of major importance." You say it's not being used as much as it should be in the clinic. It is of great promise in the clinic. Let's try to push it forward. You said that in 2014, more than 50 years after you had isolated the cannabinoid THC, and it's 2019 now. Have you seen a great push forward in cannabis research in the last 5 years?
Well, it slowly became obvious that some of the compounds have medicinal effects. But at the beginning, we wanted to see, to work on the chemistry, to see what the compounds are, what they do, where they do that, whether there is a specific mechanism, whether there is a specific system, and it turned out to be true. The endocannabinoid system, the endogenous cannabinoid system, is a very important one. It's actually involved in a huge number of physiological reactions in human diseases. As a matter of fact, in a recent review, some scientists from NIH, very important central scientists, published that the cannabinoid system is involved in essentially all human diseases, one way or another. And this is important, so we have to investigate it thoroughly. And, when we continued investigations, and many others did, we found that some of the compounds that are present in cannabis, both THC and cannabidiol, CBD, can be used for certain, as drugs for certain diseases. But of course, one has to do that under a well-designed medical regulation. I mean, you cannot just take cannabis THC for every disease or even for any disease without knowing exactly how much to take, how to take it, how often to take it, and so on. It's like any other drug. One cannabidiol, we published it. We did a clinical study with epileptic patients way back in 1980, and we gave them 200 milligrams of pure cannabidiol, CBD. And it worked extremely well. And of course, this was done after we had worked quite a lot on mice and rats in animal models of epilepsy, and other people had done that as well. So we went ahead and did a clinical trial, and it turned out to be a very positive one. Unfortunately, probably because of legal or bureaucratic reasons, it was not taken up, and it took another 30 years for people to start using cannabidiol in epilepsy. Now, cannabidiol is an approved drug in the U.S. for certain types of epilepsy.
That's wonderful that work was pushed forward. And I agree with you that there needs to be well-designed medical regulations. I think the frustration that many people have, everyday people, is that things are not moving forward fast enough. Like you mentioned, there are, the endocannabinoid system is involved in all areas of human diseases. So there's so much promise for what can be done to help everyday people, but it just seems like it's going so slow, and people are getting very, very frustrated with the speed that it's taking. What's the reason why it's taking so long for the medical community, the scientific community, to really take hold of what's possible with cannabis?
Well, most probably because there are no clinical trials. You see, for a drug, for a compound to become a drug, it has to undergo clinical trials. Of course, there is a lot of research that has to be done before the clinical trials, but ultimately clinical trials will show whether a compound, a drug, can be used, should be used. And unfortunately, there are very few clinical trials. So, for example, to the best of my knowledge, there hasn't been a major clinical trial in cancer. Thousands of people use cannabinoids, medical cannabis, whatever, for cancer, but there hasn't been a single clinical trial. So physicians will not prescribe cannabis with cancer because they don't have the background of clinical trials. And the same is true for many other diseases.
Right.
There are a group of diseases called autoimmune diseases, diseases in which the body attacks its own cells. Why it does that, We don't really know, but it doesn't matter at the moment. This is what happens. The body attacks itself. These are called autoimmune diseases, and cannabidiol has been found to be a good drug in autoimmune diseases, at least in some of them. But unfortunately, there have been no clinical trials, so cannabidiol, CBD, cannot be used in autoimmune diseases. It's maybe you are missing an important drug.
Is it because the most of the drugs are developed by for-profit pharmaceutical companies, and because cannabis can't be patented, is this the reason why they're not looking to invest in research and clinical trials to produce drugs from cannabis?
Well, I don't know. Maybe, I don't know. Really, I mean, many drugs that are used on natural products that have been modified. You cannot buy penicillin in a drugstore. You buy a derivative of penicillin. You don't buy cortisone, which is a hormone, important one. You buy derivatives of cortisone. So chances are that if companies were interested, they would make better derivatives of the natural product. Maybe the companies are doing that. But at the moment, the fact is that there are out there cannabinoids, which in certain cases have to first to undergo clinical trials, and if they are successful, they can become official drugs. So at the moment, unfortunately, a lot of people use cannabis without having the background of clinical trials, and this is certainly not acceptable.
Absolutely. You say it's not acceptable. Is it because there are dangers associated with using cannabis without a doctor's supervision?
Well, THC causes different effects at low doses and at high doses. So one should know exactly what one is taking. You don't take a drug just taking a drug. You have to know exactly what you take. When you go to a doctor for any disease and he gives you a drug, he will give you the amount of drug you're supposed to take, the times, so many times a day you have to take the drug, etc. He doesn't say just take antibiotic, bye-bye. He will give you exact details how to do it. With cannabinoids, unfortunately, we don't have that data.
Right.
Not yet.
There's a lot of room for growth and research and data in regards to cannabinoids. What do regular people do in the meantime? And this is the reason why we see so many people who are self-medicating with cannabis. And we know that this is not the best way to operate, but there are people who are actually suffering with terrible illnesses, whether that be chronic conditions like cancer, diabetes, etc. There's so much room for growth, but people don't have solutions. So people have taken to some extent, self-medicating. What can regular people do to help push forward, like you mentioned, push it forward, because it doesn't seem like the scientific community is really taking hold of the possibilities. How can regular, everyday people help this effort?
Well, I assume that some pressure has to be put on government, any government, to go ahead with clinical trials. I mean, clinical trials are done today by pharmaceutical companies. That's fine. They have done a lot of important work in this field. But if pharmaceutical companies are not doing it, I see no reason why governments shouldn't do it. They have the money. So, okay, it's different. But if we want to know whether cannabis or THC or CBD works against the disease, let's say cancer, and cancer is not one disease. There are many diseases. But if you want to know whether these compounds work in cancer, clinical trial should be done. So if the companies don't do it, then government should do it. I don't know who in the States can do that. FDA has never done a clinical trial, but They have to start somewhere, maybe.
So basically, it's either the pharmaceutical companies or governments who need to fund the research that people can take advantage of the benefits that you've already identified through preclinical research of cannabis. At the same time, we know that governments don't typically do this. So this is the quandary that most people are in the middle of. Can we just talk a little bit about what has been done in specific chronic conditions, just to elucidate for people what's possible out there? Because I think that one of the big things that needs to be done is we need to take away the stigma. And people believe scientists, they believe doctors. There's actually a young lady in my church who I told that she could use medical marijuana for her symptoms of lupus. And she said, oh, I don't want to mess with that. So what we have is a lot of people who really could get relief and who would qualify for medical marijuana who won't use it because of the stigma. So what we're looking to do with you, because you are essentially the person who started the movement here, is really help people understand that this is something that they can really get benefit from, of course, used in the proper medical environment. So let's talk about some research that's been done on, for instance, you said autoimmune diseases like lupus.
Let me first clarify. You speak of medical marijuana. I don't know what is medical marijuana. Medical marijuana can be anything. It can have a lot of THC, it can have a lot of CBD, it can have 50-50. Medical marijuana is a general term. It's like saying antibiotic. That doesn't mean much. One has to define the amount of material that one gets. I mean, you don't take a huge amount of anything. One has to know exactly what the amounts are. I mean, you cannot take any amount. For any disease, one has to know exactly how much is needed. So speaking of medical marijuana, it's not a drug. It's a concept, if you wish. It's not a drug. One has to have much better definition of what one takes. A few examples. There was an excellent clinical trial on schizophrenia with cannabidiol, CBD, in Germany, and Dr. Leveke was head of the research, gave 800 milligrams a day to schizophrenic patients, and the results were excellent, outstanding. So there were other clinical trials, smaller ones, that could not repeat Dr. Leveke's results. But so here we have something which seems to be very promising, and we should try to go ahead giving cannabidiol, not THC, definitely not THC to schizophrenic patients, because THC can cause an attack. But cannabidiol seems to be an excellent drug, but we need additional clinical trials. Schizophrenia, 1% of the population, any population, 1% of the population is schizophrenic. So here we have millions of people that can be helped.
Absolutely.
One.
Thank you for clarifying. Thank you for clarifying medical marijuana. That term is definitely used in this country to denote people who have received a license or a card or approval to see a doctor or to get marijuana cannabis from a dispensary with the doctor's permission. So thank you for clarifying that it is absolutely a very broad term, and it needs to be very specific in terms of what the instructions are from the doctor for what specific condition a person is being treated with. What about anxiety and seizures? You talked about that, the seizure work, additional work on things like anxiety, depression, ADHD. Have there been any work, scientific studies on those type of conditions?
Yes, they have been, but not enough. Anxiety is a complicated situation. Most people would say that at low doses, cannabidiol and maybe THC lower anxiety. CBD definitely does that. But again, we have to know the doses with CBD. This is less important because CBD doesn't have side effects. So overdosing with CBD is not so dangerous. But overdosing with THC is definitely a major problem. And quite a lot of psychiatric departments get people that, usually young people that have taken huge amounts of THC and have a psychiatric attack and end up in the psychiatry department. So one has to go ahead with medical marijuana and define it, not just say medical marijuana.
Absolutely.
And with cancer, for example, it's outrageous that there have been no clinical trials.
Right. Yeah, because, I mean, you talk about schizophrenia being 1% of the population. Cancer, so many different variations. It's many, many, many more people who need to have relief in regards to cancer. And like you said, there's not been much that's happened. You mentioned about people overdosing on THC and using it in a capacity where they're really suffering because of the consequences of this. And this is with young people.
Yeah.
And I think what we're seeing is breeding of the cannabis plant to potentiate the THC for the psychoactive effects. Is that what people have been doing over the years, such that there's more THC than it used to be through natural growth?
It's complicated.
Yeah.
Yes, marijuana, cannabis, used to be sold with 3, 4, 5% THC. Now one has about sometimes 20% THC.
Mm-hmm.
This is something that one has to take care of. Another problem is that the activity of THC is modified by compounds that are found in marijuana. We call that the entourage effect. And this is not well known. What are the compounds that modify THC and make it slightly different or make its activity slightly different? We don't know enough about it.
Right.
But basically we need again and again, I've said that, clinical trials. Cancer, there are so many types of cancer. I'm not sure that if THC or cannabidiol at some dose, very high dose maybe, works against one type of cancer, it does not necessarily have to work against another one. So all this has to be undertaken, and I hope that we shall see clinical trials in addition to all the research that's being done outside clinical trials. Our paper on anandamide, which we published in 1992, has been cited thousands of times. Hundreds of people have investigated it. That's fine. But it has never been administered to a human being.
Mm-hmm.
Again, is it a good drug? I don't know. It has never been given to a human.
Right. So you've done a lot of preliminary groundwork. People have not taken up the mantle to continue the work that's necessary to help with these chronic conditions. What about diabetes?
Yeah.
I was reading in a magazine article in Forbes, I think, about diabetes, recent work that had been done about cannabis and diabetes. Are you familiar with that work and what it said about
diabetes? There are two major types of diabetes, type 1 and type 2. Type 1, cannabidiol in animals has been shown to be very good in diabetes type 1, and as the mechanism in animals and humans in diabetes type 1 is essentially the same, chances are that cannabidiol in diabetes type 1 will be a very good drug, but it has, of course, to be looked into human patients. But it seems to be a good promise there. Diabetes type 2 is more complicated, and there are results that have shown that yes, it's good, and other people have not been able to repeat the work. So there we don't have enough data.
And what are they seeing exactly that's good about the effects of cannabidiol with type 1 diabetes? What are the effects that they're showing that are promising?
Well, in diabetes type 1, the body attacks the cells that produce insulin, the compound that has to do with sugar metabolism. And most of the cells that produce insulin are destroyed in diabetes type 1. So the body doesn't have enough insulin. But if cannabidiol is administered, at least in mice, in animals, in mice, then most of the cells are not destroyed and they continue to produce insulin. So here we have something that probably happens in humans as well, but we have to see a good trial. I strongly believe that this is what's going to happen next. People will be looking at diabetes type 1 and CBD.
And diabetes type 1 is actually one of the more debilitating, I believe, because there aren't as many treatments, because once the cells are damaged, people are not able to, you can't recreate them, right? So I guess the effects would be most beneficial if there were a drug, if it was done preventatively before the damage is done to the pancreas, etc. Correct?
Yeah, well, yeah, of course, as usual, as with most diseases, it's better to start treating the disease at the beginning and not when so many of the cells are destroyed. That's common sense.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah. Well, I assume that we've covered most of the things you were interested in.
Absolutely. I appreciate you so much for giving me the opportunity to talk with you. People are really going to get a lot of benefit from understanding a little bit more from the person who actually was at the forefront of it all. And we appreciate you so much. And thank you so much for your time, Dr. Mechoulam.
Yeah, you're welcome.